Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. This is the first of what is hoped to be quite a long series that the UWC Law Faculty will be presenting on issues that are relevant to our community and just presenting these issues in an easy to understand way so that anybody who needs access to this information can get it. So we'll be covering a wide array of topics over the next few weeks. We'll be looking at company law, we'll be looking at social grants, we'll be looking at getting protection orders. So we've got really a wide range of topics to consider, and I think it will be a valuable contribution to the discourse around these issues. The aim of these talks is to make things easy to understand, simple, giving like a quick little bite of information so that someone who is looking for this information will not have trouble. So it's accessible, easy to find information, and an easy process to follow. So for today, we're going to be looking at how to report gender-based violence. And we've got our colleague from UWC, Cherith Sanger, who has been doing a lot of amazing work in this field and is really quite knowledgeable on various issues around gender-based violence. But for today, we'll stick to how to report gender-based violence, and I will now hand you over to my colleague, Cherith.
Thank you so much, Dr. Basson, for the lovely welcome. And thank you for having me here today. I'm so excited to be part of the series where we actually make the knowledge that we have available to people. It's such an important part of being a lawyer that we share the information we have or that we know and what we do, because the law is often so inaccessible to people. So I'm very happy about the Law Faculty starting this series.
Wonderful.
So as Yvette or Dr. Basson has said today, I call all these different things for today. I'm going to try to be formal and call you Dr. Basson. But basically, today we're going to talk about gender-based violence and how to report gender-based violence. But before we talk about how to report it, I think it's important that we all have an understanding about what we mean when we talk about gender-based violence. What is gender-based violence? So very generally and on a very, very basic level, gender-based violence is any violence that is perpetrated against somebody because of their gender. So this could include because you are a woman, because you are a man, because you are transgender, because we could even talk about the fact that it could be a lesbian, or because you are a gay man. So gender-based violence is actually quite broad, but typically when we often talk about it or use it interchangeably with the terminology violence against women. So violence against women specifically speaks about or refers to violence directed against women because they are women. So then that would exclude men, exclude transgender people, exclude lesbians, exclude gay men, right? Because the word gender is not only about women. The terminology gender-based violence is thus quite broad. And also, gender-based violence can mean many different things. Often when we talk about gender-based violence, we automatically think about physical assault. We think about rape, the kind of physical manifestations of or physical ways in which violence is used against us. But the reality is that violence can actually be very broad. Violence can actually, or gender-based violence can actually include being excluded from an opportunity, for example, or excluded, let's say, for consideration for being promoted in your workplace, or being excluded from a leadership opportunity based on your gender. It's not only these kind of physical manifestations that constitute gender-based violence. Gender-based violence means many, many things. But for purposes of our discussion today, we are going to be talking about gender-based violence in the form of sexual violence. So that would be rape and sexual assault and other sexual offenses. We will also be talking about gender-based violence in terms of domestic violence. So many people still understand domestic violence to be family violence, right? And that is still correct. But domestic violence is a bit broader than that, and I'll mention that very briefly soon. And lastly, I want to talk about gender-based violence in the workplace, specifically in relation to sexual harassment. So I want to talk about how we can report gender-based violence in those specific situations. So in other words, where there's a sexual offense or sexual violence, domestic violence, and then in the workplace, in the form of sexual harassment. So let's look a little bit at sexual violence. When I'm talking about sexual violence now, I'm talking about, like I said earlier, the rape, the sexual assault, and other offenses. In other words, sexual conduct or sexual acts which are against the law. In other words, it is a crime to engage in such sexual conduct because the other party has not consented to it. Okay? So rape is forced sexual intercourse. Okay, so in other words, there's no consent, it's not voluntary. So what do we do when we are experiencing sexual violence? And it's also important that we acknowledge, very often sexual offenses are committed. And just because it is not rape doesn't mean that it's not important. So if somebody's being sexually assaulted, that is also a serious crime. And what should we do when we experience sexual violence of this kind? So what we should do is that we need to go to the police station. The South African Police Service is responsible for receiving reports of sexual violence. So you actually need to go to the police station to open a case, okay? We're not talking about charging anybody yet. This is a common misunderstanding. When you are going to the police to tell them your story, to say how you have been violated, and they then need to look into your statement that they take from you and investigate it. And they need to see whether there is enough information to send to the prosecutors for them to take the case to court and hopefully have the person who perpetrated the sexual violence found guilty and imprisoned. That's in a very, very, very basic explanation of how the criminal justice system works. And of course, the type of punishment involved is imprisonment, fines too, and other sorts of sentences. But imprisonment is very common for sexual offenses. The courts in South Africa are actually taking it very seriously now, and we've improved our approach in the courts to rape and other sexual offenses against women and other vulnerable groups such as transgender people, lesbians, and gay men. But so the point is, it's a serious offense and you need to go to the police station. It is, however, important for me to say something. So we have a police station that is, or police officers that are meant to perform very specific types of duties when it comes to sexual violence. The reality is, however, that they don't always do what they need to do. And on that basis, it is always important that if you are the victim of sexual violence, that somebody goes with you to support you, or that you approach an NGO or a community-based organization in your community to assist you in going to the police station to ensure that they do what they do. Women have reported being turned away unassisted, being laughed at, and just feeling re-traumatized or re-victimized by the experience at the police station. But know that there are organizations out there that can assist you in these processes. Rape Crisis is a very good organization that does this type of work. Even organizations like the Women's Legal Center can give you legal advice on the process. But the most important thing for today is to know that the police actually have a duty to assist you when you go to the police station to report sexual violence. Okay, I now want to move on in the interest of time, and I want to talk a little bit about domestic violence. So what is domestic violence? We have a Domestic Violence Act, and most people still see it, like I said earlier, as family violence, and this is true. Our current Domestic Violence Act is actually the new act that was the Prevention of Family Violence Act before. So in terms of the Domestic Violence Act, it recognizes that women and children in particular are very vulnerable to domestic violence. What this also entails is that they've now, it explains a range of different types of domestic violence. So there's not just one form of domestic violence. There are many different forms of domestic violence. And what is very good about our Domestic Violence Act is that it recognizes that verbal abuse, financial abuse, and other types of abuses that are not physical or sexual in nature, that also constitutes domestic violence. The Act is very good in that way. So what the Act also provides for is for somebody to obtain a protection order. This protection order is actually obtained from the magistrate's court, but this protection order is meant to be put in place to assist the victim. So let's say somebody is experiencing, let's say a woman who's in a relationship with a man is experiencing sexual violence regularly, she could then approach the magistrate court for assistance to get a protection order. And if this individual at any stage rapes her or commits another act of sexual violence, she would then be able to take that protection order to the police. However, if you do not have a protection order, if the victim does not have a protection order, it doesn't mean that the police cannot assist her. She can still go to the police for assistance and report that she's experienced an act of domestic violence, or even call from a phone at the scene of the domestic violence for the police to come out and assist her. The police also have a duty to explain to her what she can do to protect herself. They should, for example, say, you need to obtain a protection order at the magistrate's court nearest to where you live or work, right? So there are these different processes in place. But once again, the police play a very important role in domestic violence cases. Once again, I would appeal to be supported in applying for a protection order and in going to the police station to report domestic violence. Let's say that you do have a protection order. When you get that protection order from the magistrate's court, a warrant of arrest will be attached to that protection order. If the abuser or the perpetrator of the domestic violence commits another act of domestic violence, once you have this protection order in your possession, you can then take that protection order to the police station, make an affidavit telling them what has happened, in other words, explaining the act of domestic violence. And then what would happen is that they would then need to execute or use that warrant of arrest by arresting the respondent. And then the respondent's conduct becomes a criminal offense once again for contravening the court order or condition in the court order. I now lastly want to talk about sexual harassment. Now, sexual harassment that I'm talking about now is specifically relevant in the workplace. And it's important for you to know that our labor law recognizes that sexual harassment is a form of unfair discrimination. So if somebody at work, it could range from inappropriate statements being made to you of a sexual nature, a manager badgering you to engage in a sexual relationship or sexual act with her or him in order to get a promotion, what could even be rape. There are processes that are meant to be in place in the workplace to report sexual harassment. So you should go to your human resources, or if there's even a particular individual appointed for these types of matters, you need to go there to go report the sexual harassment in the workplace. And what's meant to happen is that your employer is meant to investigate the matter and to take it forward into a formal disciplinary if there's evidence to warrant that. By this, I mean a formal disciplinary hearing in the workplace. Also note that if you are unhappy with that, there are also other processes in place to take the matter further, such as to the CCMA, the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration, or if there is a bargaining council. If you work in a particular type of industry, there could be a bargaining council. And if this is in place, you then need to use the route of the bargaining council. So I've touched on sexual violence, domestic violence, and sexual harassment now. In terms of sexual forms of gender-based violence, it could be that woman that I referred to earlier, who's being raped by her partner, by an intimate partner. She actually has 3 different ways or routes to take in reporting or taking this matter forward. She can go to the police station to open a case of rape. She could go she could also use the Domestic Violence Act for recourse. So there are 2 different ways, the criminal law route and the civil law route, as we call it, using the protection order or the Domestic Violence Act. It's actually different. In another example, the woman that is being sexually harassed by a manager at work, she can actually also go to a workplace, and if she's not happy to the CCMA or to the bargaining council. But she can also go open a case of, be it if it's in the form of rape or if it's in the form of any other sexual offense, she can also take that forward using criminal law, so by going to the police. So there are many different avenues for recourse, and using the one does not mean you cannot use the other. So it's very important that people understand the different options that they have. So there are many different aspects of gender-based violence and reporting that we could talk about, or how to take a matter forward, including, for example, to the Equality Court. And the Equality Court is actually a wonderful court that exists on both the Magistrates Court level and the High Court level. And it has amazing powers, from ordering an apology to having the National Prosecuting Authority take a matter forward to awarding damages, money for harm suffered. All of this does exist as well. So if, let's say, you are not, let's say this violence that you experienced did not take place in the workplace, but let's say it took place at the social club. Let's say you belong to a sports club, and let's say that one of the other members of the sports club is sexually harassing you. You can also use the Equality Court as a way to address such a matter. Or if, for example, you are unhappy with the sexual harassment policy or the failure of the sports club to assist you, even though you told them you are experiencing sexual harassment, you can also take such a matter to the Equality Court. You go to the Equality Court and you fill out a form explaining your situation, and you submit it with the clerk of this court, and you then take the matter forward in that way. So there are avenues for recourse. The issue is that sometimes the systems don't work the way they need to. And on that basis, I always say, let's get support from the NGOs who provide these services, or even somebody in your community who is willing to assist. So as long as you have somebody with you to keep a record of your experience and to ensure that you get the services you are entitled to, that is what is important when it comes to gender-based violence. There's much more that I can say, but I'm going to end there. And if anybody has any questions, yes, please tell me. Please ask me if there's anything else I need to mention.
Thank you so much for that, Cherith. Wow. There are actually things that you mentioned that I had no idea about. So thank you very, very much for that. If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to ask in the chat or to unmute yourself. I actually have a question just to get things started, which is a lot of people would say, what is the point of a protection order if it's just a piece of paper? How does that help the situation in any way? So what would you say is the value in getting a protection order?
That is such an important question and such a real question. I've actually had women asking me this when I worked at the Women's Legal Center in doing daily legal advice. This was a question that has come up before. What does it mean? Is it really going to protect me or stop the experiences I'm having with the abusive partner or with the perpetrator? The reality is that a protection order in certain circumstances does actually deter somebody. I can't say in all circumstances. I will not say that today, because there are situations where violent partners or people, doesn't need to be your partner in terms of the Domestic Violence Act, can even become more violent. The reality is that you can also end up dead if you stay in these relationships. Or you can also, one of your children may be killed by your partner or somebody else that you love or care for. And the truth is that this has happened. I've had a client like this. Actually, there's two people I know of. In both scenarios, their children were murdered. So, the protection order, in many cases, it does serve as a deterrent, because what it does is they know that if they commit another act for certain individuals, there may be a serious issue around mental issues, mental illness, whatever the case may be, where a protection order does not serve that, or somebody who has serious controlling or power issues, that does also exist. But I still promote the protection order process, because there are many cases it does help. And I think that once, if it is possible, and I want to be careful what I'm saying, because we know that in communities, it is not always possible for a woman, and this is the common scenario, to take her children and leave the abusive partner. But it is best to try to go to an NGO for help, or try to go to a shelter like the Sarki Batman shelter and say, this is my situation. I need to get out of the house. I fear for my life. No, this is a real issue. And I also want to mention to you that it is possible in a protection order to ask for the abuser to not enter part of the house or to enter the property at all, in fact. That is also a possibility. The courts won't easily grant that, because we also know that it constitutes an eviction. But if the facts of the matter are so serious that it is necessary the courts should do so. Again, I really push for people to have somebody from an NGO, if they have somebody who can assist them pro bono, be it a lawyer or somebody from their community, to go with them and support them in this process. People are out there doing this work on a daily basis. It's just that sometimes when we are experiencing violence, that we don't, because of the state we're in and the impact that it has on us, not only physical violence, verbal abuse, intimidation, psychological abuse, it sometimes disables us from taking steps to address what we're going through. And often women are judged for not taking steps. Oh, why didn't she go get out of the relationship sooner? It's her fault, she didn't do enough. But part of the abuse that you experience is that it immobilizes you or disables you from going forward. Not to mention that in our society today, women still primarily are the ones who are reliant on men financially. So this is also a real issue with how our societies often structured. Of course, there are changes where women are working or women are more independent financially, but not across all of the classes in South Africa. So there's also this particular issue. So yes, it is complicated, but I say with the necessary support, it's important to know also that the police actually is meant to assist a victim of domestic violence in finding alternative accommodation or shelter. The woman should not return to a home or a family home that is shared with the abuser.
Yes.
So all of these things, that is actually, legislatively, it's written into the law. But I also want to state, all of the legislation that we spoke about today is gender neutral. So it doesn't mean that a woman could not be a perpetrator of domestic violence or sexual violence or sexual harassment. A man could too. The reality is, unfortunately, because of how gender norms and the roles are constructed in our society, is that men who are sometimes the victims of domestic violence and sexual violence are not willing to speak out because of how they are mocked and laughed at by service providers. At the police station, or even not taken seriously at the courts. There's a lot of the type of stigma attached to it, or seeing men as unrapeable, for example.
Yes.
And that should not be the case. And also, similarly for gay men. And let's also mention that even if we are in same-sex relationships, it doesn't mean that there's no domestic violence there. Domestic violence can also play out there, same situation. So yeah, it's gender neutral, and anybody who is a victim of violence can use the Domestic Violence Act, can use the Equality Act, can use the labor law legislation for sexual harassment, and can use the criminal law as an avenue for recourse.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cherith. Thanks everyone for joining us. We will see you in the next few weeks for the rest of our series. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Yvette. Have a lovely
Bye-bye.
day. Bye.